Pembangunan menjadi hal mutlak yang dilakukan setiap negara demi tercapainya kemajuan bangsa. Pembangunan harus memperhatikan segala aspek kehidupan agar tercipta pembangunan yang berkelanjutan. September tahun 2015, 17 tujuan pembangunan berkelanjutan atau Sustainable Development Goals telah disahkan oleh PBB. Nah, tujuan SDGs ini menggantikan Millennium Development Goals atau yang kita kenal sebagai MDGs yang dicanangkan pada tahun 2000 dan berakhir pada tahun 2015. Insight kali ini akan menggali apa saja target pembangunan berkelanjutan yang ditandatangani oleh 193 negara ini dan mampukah Indonesia mengimplementasikannya. Bersama saya, Desi Anwar, inilah Insight. Pada akhir tahun 2015, 193 negara mengadopsi 17 target tujuan pembangunan berkelanjutan atau yang disebut sebagai Sustainable Development Goals, SDGs. Nah, sebagai salah satu negara yang mengadopsi konsep ini, pemerintah Indonesia optimistis dapat mencapai semua target SDGs pada tahun 2030.
Konsep Sustainable Development Goals (SDGs) atau tujuan pembangunan yang berkelanjutan melanjutkan konsep pembangunan Millennium Development Goals atau MDGs. SDGs dicanangkan tahun ini hingga 2030. Pencanangan tersebut diikuti 193 negara. Ada 17 target pencapaian SDGs, diantaranya pengentasan kemiskinan, kesehatan yang terjamin, kualitas pendidikan, persamaan gender, energi bersih dan terjangkau, peningkatan kesejahteraan ekonomi dan lapangan pekerjaan, keadilan hukum, dan institusi yang kuat.
Tujuannya adalah dengan ada komitmen internasional di seluruh dunia, disepakati oleh seluruh dunia, maka pembangunan kita itu jelas indikatornya. Misalnya bahwa diharapkan pada tahun 2030 tidak lagi orang miskin. Maka negara seluruh dunia berupaya untuk melakukan program-program dalam rangka mengatasi kemiskinan.
Direktur Sustainable Development Solution Network Jeffrey Shah yakin Indonesia bisa mengimplementasikan ke-17 target SDGs.
First, given the span of this country, the still large rural population, the fact that in many places in Indonesia there still are pockets of poverty, SDG 1 on ending extreme poverty is definitely one of the priorities.
Keyakinan Indonesia bisa menurunkan angka kemiskinan sebagai salah satu dari target SDGs juga diungkapkan oleh Koordinator Sustainable Development Solution Network Indonesia.
Saya kira bisa. Ya, kenapa? Ya, sekarang aja kita sudah growing 5% lebih. Di dunia ini yang growing segitu cuma berapa negara? Ya, Cina ya masih walaupun 7%. Terus kemudian beberapa negara, Brazil malahan turun. Indonesia steady terus.
SDGs merupakan rencana aksi di beberapa bidang terkait manusia dan kesejahteraan. SDGs adalah lanjutan dari Millennium Development Goals atau MDGs yang digaungkan 189 pemerintahan di dunia sejak 2000 hingga 2015. Teddy Zuhari, Jakarta.
Ya, pemirsa, Sustainable Development Goals atau yang dikenal sebagai SDGs itu merupakan tujuan pembangunan berkelanjutan yang berorientasi pada kemanusiaan dan juga kepada lingkungan. Nah, Indonesia dengan sejumlah negara lainnya berkomitmen untuk melakukan pembangunan negara dan seluruh dunia agar menjadi lebih berkelanjutan. Nah, apa-apa saja aspek dari SDGs ini? Mari kita lihat. Sustainable Development Goals yang dikenal sebagai SDGs telah disepakati oleh 193 negara dalam sebuah konferensi PBB di New York pada bulan September tahun lalu. Nah, SDGs itu merupakan kelanjutan dari MDGs, Millennium Development Goals yang telah berakhir pada tahun lalu, yaitu tahun 2015. SDGs ini mengintegrasikan dan menyeimbangkan 3 dimensi pembangunan, yaitu ekonomi, sosial, dan juga lingkungan. Nah, sementara itu di dalam SDGs ini berbeda dari MDGs, misalnya terdapat 17 tujuan, 169 target, dan 241 indikator yang harus dicapai pada 2030. Jelas kalau dibanding dengan MDGs jauh lebih ambisius. Dan tujuan SDGs diantaranya adalah mengakhiri segala bentuk kemiskinan dan juga untuk mengurangi kelaparan, serta mengupayakan ketahanan pangan dan perbaikan nutrisi dan pertanian yang berkelanjutnya. SDGs juga mewujudkan kehidupan masyarakat yang sehat dan juga mewujudkan pemerataan dalam pendidikan yang berkualitas. Selain itu, SDGs mewujudkan kesetaraan gender, memberdayakan perempuan serta anak-anak, dan mewujudkan ketersediaan air dan sanitasi bagi seluruh masyarakat. Upaya untuk mencapai SDGs pada tahun 2030 difokuskan pada 5 aspek, yaitu yang pertama adalah aspek masyarakat, di mana seluruh masyarakat harus dapat mengembangkan potensi yang dimilikinya tanpa terkecuali. Ada juga aspek bumi, yaitu keberlangsungan bumi yang harus dipertahankan melalui pola konsumsi dan produksi yang berkelanjutan, tata kelola sumber daya alam, dan juga aksi yang nyata terhadap perubahan iklim. Kemudian dari aspek kemakmuran, nah pembangunan ekonomi, sosial, dan juga teknologi untuk mencapai kemakmuran masyarakat itu harus dilakukan tentu saja selaras dengan alam. Selanjutnya perdamaian. Nah, perdamaian, keadilan, serta lingkungan sosial yang bebas dari kekerasan dan ketakutan juga harus diwujudkan oleh SDGs. Dan terakhir, kemitraan atau partnership. SDGs dapat dicapai melalui kemitraan global dari sejumlah negara atas dasar solidaritas global. Dan keberhasilan SDGs tentu tidak dapat dicapai hanya melalui upaya pemerintah saja. Dibutuhkan kerjasama oleh sejumlah sektor, yaitu pemerintah, sektor swasta, akademisi, dan tentu juga lembaga masyarakat. Sehingga SDGs atau Sustainable Development Goals ini dapat diwujudkan pada tahun 2030. Dan pemirsa, pencapaian 17 target SDGs atau Sustainable Development Goals dalam waktu 15 tahun saja ini bisa dikatakan sangat ambisius. Walau inovasi dalam bidang teknologi ini bisa sangat membantu, namun konflik-konflik yang saat ini terjadi di sejumlah negara serta adanya perubahan iklim menjadi tantangan besar. Nah, sejauh mana target-target tujuan pembangunan berkelanjutan dapat tercapai? Simak perbincangan saya bersama Administrator dari United Nations Development Program atau UNDP dan juga mantan Perdana Menteri Selandia Baru, Helen Clark. Mr. Clark, Helen, it's good to have you in Jakarta. And 2016, the beginning of the UN Sustainable Development Goals, and we had the Millennium Development Goals. Very briefly, what would be the main challenges for the next 15 years in trying to implement this goal worldwide?
Well, they're universal goals, and they're much bigger and more ambitious goals than the Millennium Development Goals. Indonesia, of course, did very well against the Millennium Development Goals. A lot of countries did. But now everybody has to lift their act. And it's not just for developing countries, it's developed countries too. So my country, New Zealand, it's got to look at its issues. What about its relative poverty? What about its inequalities? What about its environmental challenges? Everybody has to step up. It's a whole of government agenda, so you need to be looking at whether your economic policy is actually in harmony with the environment. Is it helpful or unhelpful to inequalities in the society? You need to take a much more holistic view of development.
Okay, and some would argue that sometimes, economic development does not really go hand in hand with sustainability and so on and so forth. For a developing country like Indonesia, would you say what would be the main priorities? What should Indonesia do in order to make sure that our economic development is together with sustainability?
Well, I think there's several things. Obviously, one of the big challenges that Indonesia faces is the annual forest fires, which last year were particularly bad. But it's not rocket science how to deal with it. It will require quite sustained training around not burning. And the sorts of fires that get away here in Indonesia are the peat fires, which can go for a very, very long time. So it's going to be about agricultural modernisation and technology and awareness of how to prevent this. Another major challenge in Indonesia is keeping the tropical forests, which are not just the lungs of Indonesia, they're the lungs of the world. They matter to us all. UNDP has been part of a partnership here on the restoring the degraded forests and stopping further deforestation. We have to do that in a way which helps the people who depend on the forest for their livelihoods to survive as well. That's about more balanced development. Yes, we need growth. We need inclusive growth. We need growth and harmony with nature.
But you see the countries actually, you know, we had the Paris conference, the climate change conference, and of course, climate issues very much an important on top of everybody's agenda. But you see governments actually really committing to implementing, you know, basically the ideals or the goals of the Paris climate change.
This is the issue. The Paris Climate Agreement is very ambitious. And at this time, if we add up all the commitments that countries have made, they don't add up to the level of ambition of the agreement. So we need more ambition, but we need people to start implementing the commitments that they have made. Otherwise, they're just words on paper. So if we are serious about trying to keep global warming peaking at no more than 1.5 degrees Celsius, we'd better move very, very fast. And that's why what Indonesia does is of global significance, because of its role as a guardian, a custodian of such huge tracts of tropical forest still.
Now, the SDGs, basically, there's people, planet, prosperity, but there's also this idea of peace and partnership. And we don't see a lot of peace at the moment. There are areas in the world which is, you know, with conflicts and particularly in the Middle East, for example. And the other thing is, how can we actually enhance partnership? And particularly this is under the UN umbrella, so that everybody is basically on the same boat, rowing to the same destination.
Well, if there's one thing above all that sets back development, it's a breakdown of peace and stability. We see Syria, which was a stable middle-income country. Its people now plunged into wretched poverty, more than 4 million of the refugees, 6.5 million displaced in the country, children who haven't been in school for years, health services broken down. It's a horror story. So that is not the way to go. And this new agenda does have a specific goal on peaceful and inclusive societies as a basis for development. No sustainable development without peace, no peace without sustainable development. So that the two have to go together. That means the rule of law, it means access to justice, it means representative and participatory institutions. There's a lot of things that go into peaceful and inclusive
anytime soon. I mean, the SDGs is a 15-year project, but you know, with what's going on in the Middle East, the refugee crisis, the economic downturn that we're still feeling all over the world, particularly in Europe, and the United States, you know, going through an election that we might have a president that's not very sympathetic to some of these global goals. Are you optimistic?
Yes.
I mean, what? Yes, I mean, you have to be optimistic, right? But you know, do you see that we are going on the right path, at least on some of those things?
Look, we see some very, very difficult trends, whether it's the economic trends, because the global economy is not in a good space. The level of youth unemployment is very challenging. There are a lot of conflicts and there's a lot of environmental challenges. So that's just for starters. But do I have confidence that humanity can deal with these challenges? Yes, I do. We do see human progress. Look, we're barely 70 years from the end of World War II, one of the most devastating wars the world ever saw. Does Europe fight itself now, Western Europe? No, it has a European Union. It lives in peace and harmony within that union. I look at this country, Indonesia. Not so long ago, there were very, very authoritarian governments. Indonesia transitioned to democracy. It shares its lessons of that, its lessons of running good elections around the world. We see progress. We just want many more countries and many more people to benefit from
Now,
it.
the MDGs, the world was different in terms of the technology, but now, of course, we have, you know, the connectivity, we have the internet, we have the social media, and basically we have all these scientific innovations that we did not have maybe 15, 20 years ago. What can we do with these things in order to achieve our SDGs?
We need to see them as enablers of development. And one of the exciting areas UNDP is involved with is working with young people in innovation camps or laboratories and saying, look, what are the issues, the challenges in your society, and how would you design a solution that would do something about that? Incredible ideas come out of it. I used an example today of the underreporting of sexual and gender-based violence in Egypt, where the young people got together and they said, yeah, we're going to figure out how to deal with this. And of course, a lot of it comes back to text-based messaging systems, online platforms. In some countries, we've trained community volunteers to be on the watch out for this kind of violence and to report it through a smartphone app, which we supply to the volunteers. You can use technology for incredible ends.
And technology can help in speeding up some of these goals.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, take education. We talk about, you know, the last mile. Even in my country, there's a last mile of remote communities. But through technology, you can deliver a lesson on anything from a qualified teacher to the most remote classroom. So technology makes new things possible.
What about the young people, the millennials? Because there is this sort of gap between the older generation and the new generation. Do you see them much more involved in, taking care of the environment? Do you see them much more sort of very different approach to perhaps their parents when it comes to viewing the world and the environment around them?
I think young people are much more aware and they're much more connected. And when we look at some of the turbulence now against governments and public unrest, I think it's because young people see what's happening around the world. They say, it's not good enough here. We want change. So they're great agents of change. And I think the smart societies will be the ones that embrace and include the innovation and the energy of youth as a really powerful, transformative force in their society.
But do you see governments beginning to have SDGs as part of their policies and actually committed to implementing them?
Yes, there's been incredible take-up. I think we're now well up over 80 governments which have formally approached the UN agencies in country to say, help us mainstream this into the national plan. And as more national plans are rewritten, revisited, there'll be more requests. So we are absolutely convinced that governments are going to embrace these goals. Of course, they may emphasise some more than others, and there's very important ones like gender equality we don't want to see drop to the bottom of the pile. But from the UN point of view, we will advise on accepting all of the goals and having strategies to make them work.
You were Prime Minister, and I think you did quite well, especially with your climate change initiatives. And talking about the reporting, of course, at the end of the day, there has to be some kind of monitoring who does what. And is this part of the key indicators, for example, for how countries can implement their SDGs successfully?
Well, one of the big issues is the data. Actually, most countries won't have the data right now to be able to measure a lot of these goals. So filling in those data gaps.
Is 15 years long enough, or I mean, the MDGs just sort of, time went by very, very quickly, and we still had a lot of the goals unachieved from the MDGs.
I think the process has been different this time. So the SDGs actually had a lot of member state involvement in the design and a lot of citizen involvement.
And a lot more ambitious, like you mentioned.
Well, they're very, very ambitious, but we start with a very high level of government and global citizen awareness of them, and global business awareness too. The survey shows that they really are clued into it. With the MDGs, it came out of intergovernmental negotiations that didn't engage publics or capitals. And so they took time to get some traction. By the time I got to UNDP, about 10 years had gone by, and I said, what are we doing about these? There's only 5 years left. And we had to really scramble with acceleration campaigns to do something.
Same in Indonesia, nothing really got going for the last 5 years.
Exactly, when the minds were really focused about, well, we want to have a good story to tell at the end. So this time we start with people being very aware incorporating it into the national plans and having strategies.
But do you have currently role models or countries or maybe individuals that actually can become, role models for SDGs?
Absolutely. I mean,
maybe give some examples.
take a country like Denmark, which has made such a huge commitment to renewable energy and has very high levels of social equality and good levels of prosperity. Let's look at a country like that and say, well, what is their secret? What are they doing right?
How about closer to this part of the world? Because we know in Scandinavian countries are very much ahead in all sorts of things, from education, they're environmentally conscious society, and the gender equality. But what about sort of closer?
Well, look, here we are in Southeast Asia. I've grown up in New Zealand. In my lifetime, Southeast Asia has lifted itself from abject levels of poverty to being one of the most dynamic growth engines of the world economy. I first came to Indonesia in 1984. This is not the country it was in 1984. I first went to Thailand in 1976. Bangkok was nothing like it is today. So there has been incredible change and lessons to share. For Indonesia, definitely a story to tell on a transition from authoritarian to democratic government, stronger institutions, huge progress on lifting out of poverty, huge progress on education and healthcare.
Definitely more traffic on the road, that's for sure.
Yeah, and the Minister of Finance had some things to say about that today. But, Indonesia is a society on the move with a lot to share.
Program Tujuan Pembangunan Berkelanjutan berupa rencana aksi yang berkaitan dengan manusia dan kesejahteraan, termasuk mengentaskan masyarakat dari kemiskinan. Apa-apa saja strategi yang harus dilakukan? Akan kita ulas lebih dalam setelah informasi berikut ini. Ya pemirsa, masih dalam insight dan topik kita kali ini mengenai pembangunan berkelanjutan dalam SDGs atau Sustainable Development Goals. Dan perjuangan mengakhiri kemiskinan telah membawa seorang Profesor Jeffrey Sachs berkeliling lebih dari 125 negara. Dan selama lebih dari 25 tahun, Profesor Jeffrey Sachs itu telah membantu merumuskan strategi ekonomi di sejumlah negara di Amerika Serikat, Eropa, Asia, dan juga Timur Tengah.
Jeffrey Sachs adalah pria kelahiran Detroit, Michigan, Amerika pada 1954. Ia menyelesaikan pendidikan sarjananya di Harvard College dengan predikat cum laude dan meraih gelar doktor di Harvard University pada 1980. Karirnya dimulai sebagai asisten profesor di Harvard dan akhirnya meraih gelar profesor pada 1983 dalam usia 28 tahun. Kebijakan dan kajian akademisnya meliputi berbagai tantangan globalisasi seperti perdagangan dan pertumbuhan ekonomi, pasar keuangan internasional, serta strategi reformasi ekonomi. Sejak pertengahan 1990 hingga kini, Profesor Jeffrey Sachs terlibat dalam reformasi ekonomi di sejumlah negara di kawasan Asia seperti India dan Tiongkok. Dia juga terlibat dalam sejumlah penelitian dan pembangunan di Indonesia, Malaysia, dan Bangladesh. Selain keahliannya di bidang pembangunan ekonomi, Sachs dikenal dengan perjuangannya mengakhiri kemiskinan. Sejak 1995, ia terlibat sepenuhnya dalam upaya negara-negara di benua Afrika lepas dari kemiskinan. Idenya berinvestasi di bidang kesehatan agar terlepas dari jerat kemiskinan telah diterapkan di berbagai penjuru Afrika. Kerja kerasnya telah membawanya menerima sejumlah penghargaan dan gelar kehormatan dari seluruh dunia. Kontribusinya dalam pembangunan berkelanjutan kini semakin nyata dengan posisinya sebagai Direktur Sustainable Development Solution Network yang dibentuk PBB pada 2012. Lembaga ini bertujuan memberi dukungan dalam implementasi dan pencapaian Sustainable Development Goals. Graviardi Kresnantyo, CNN Indonesia.
Bank Dunia atau The World Bank memperkirakan saat ini masih ada sekitar 9% penduduk dunia yang berada di bawah garis kemiskinan. Nah, jumlah ini sudah jauh berkurang dibandingkan pada tahun 90-an yang angka ini berada di sekitar 37%. Tapi sejauh mana target tujuan pembangunan berkelanjutan dapat benar-benar mengentaskan penduduk miskin di dunia? Apa-apa saja strategi yang perlu dilakukan, terutama bagi negara-negara berkembang seperti di Indonesia ini. Berikut perbincangan saya bersama Jeffrey Sachs, Director dari United Nations Sustainable Development Solution Network. Here, Professor Sachs, I mean, it's so good to see you. You're not a stranger here in Indonesia, and I think I remember meeting you last year when we were setting up the SDSN in Indonesia. Now, you're back, and Sustainable Development Goals is starting as of 2016, and this is to sort of continue from the Millennium Development Goals. Tell me a little bit how you would like Sustainable Development Goals to go forward, seeing that there's still a lot of unfinished business with the Millennium Development Goals.
The most important point is that the entire world, all 193 governments in the United Nations, adopted last September 25th 17 Sustainable Development Goals. And what those governments said is, we've got a big problem. The world economy is growing, the world population is growing, the environment is not being taken care of. Climate is changing, there's more global warming, there are more extreme weather events that are very risky, the sea level is rising. We have to find a way to combine economic development and environmental sustainability and do it in a fair way with social inclusion, or what the UN says, leaving no one behind. So those are the three big goals: economic progress, social justice, and environmental sustainability. This agenda is really important. Of course, part of the agenda is to continue and complete the work of the Millennium Development Goals, which was mostly about fighting poverty. But now we have to do more. Energy system change, because if we go on using energy the way we have been, global warming. If we go on with deforestation, destroying the habitat of millions of species. So it's a more complicated agenda. And this time, it's not just about the poor countries, it's also about the rich countries. My country, the United States, it has a huge amount of homework to do, and I'm trying to press it. I'm a professor, so I say to my country, you do your homework.
When we started the Millennium Development Goals, of course, it was a different world then as it is now. I remember you wrote the book, The End of Poverty. That was in 2005, 11 years down the line. How close are we to ending poverty? Because you said something about we should be able to end poverty in our lifetime.
This was a tremendous successful stretch, actually. If you look back in 1990, according to the World Bank, which keeps these estimates, 37% of the world's population was under the extreme poverty line, in other words, poorer than that poverty line. Today, the World Bank estimates that that's probably about 9% or 9.5%. In other words, from 37% down to 9%. We want to now go down to 0 by the year 2030. That's a heavy lift, because there are places where there still is a lot of poverty, especially rural areas. For instance, in Indonesia, more remote areas. In Africa, where I'm coming from earlier this week, still a lot of poverty, more than a third of the African population. But the progress is rapid, and technology gives us really powerful tools, especially information and communications technology. Now, anyone in the world can be connected, can have a bank account, can have an identification number, can get government documents online, can learn online, get free courses and books, if we get organized to do that.
Okay, but at the same time, the problems that we have now, I mean, like, you mentioned that the planet, the environmental, and we feel it now, especially with El Nino, with, the forest fires, with ocean depletion, with just, the environmental destructions, the fires in Canada, for example. But the type of, we have the technology now, and we have the connection, but there are other factors, like, for example, the conflicts that we didn't see, for example, in the early 2000s, and the refugee crisis, the price of oil that kind of plummeted, and that took sort of the win for this urgency to go for renewables, for example. These are some of the issues that are very different. So how can we approach it so that we can find solutions that is good for everybody?
The key is to realize that the good things aren't going to just happen on their own. Some people say, well, just let things go. And even in my profession, economics, sometimes they say the magic of the market will solve these problems. That's absolutely not the case. We have to think, where would we like to be? It's like climbing a mountain. You better understand which passes you're going to cross at which points. You don't want to get caught in the storm. You want to have a strategy to reach the summit. We need a strategy to change the energy system. We need a strategy to end the destruction of the environment. We certainly need a better strategy to end these conflicts. I regard these conflicts as completely wasteful and stupid. I blame my own government a lot for many of them, actually. And we therefore need to think, how can we achieve these goals? To my mind, that's one of the most important reasons to have sustainable development goals. It's like a New Year's resolution. At least you say, this is important for me. I have to change direction. And we're working closely with Bappenas. We're working with other ministries in Indonesia. I'm working with governments around the world. And my encouragement is think ahead. Where does this country want to be in 15 years? Where does it want to be in 30 years? How can we then make coherent, consistent plans to get to where we need to go? With the technology and know-how that we have, it's all feasible. But when we're dumb, when we get into stupid traps, or when short-term politics or corruption or other matters interferes with the long-term plans, then that's when we get into real trouble.
We're actually sabotaging our own efforts. I mean, we had the Paris, the climate agreement, and everybody was there, and everybody seemed to be quite committed to keeping it to 2 degrees by the end of the century. But do you see real action on the ground? I mean, there's one thing, the photo op, the heads of states committing something, and there's another thing with the implementation. Do you see governments actually putting words where their mouth is, or money where their mouth is?
First, I see people afraid. That's the start of wisdom, because people are recognizing this isn't a joke. This isn't just about the distant future. Climate change is now, and it's serious, and it's dangerous. So that's the start. Second, technology has improved tremendously. So photovoltaics, solar energy, the price has come down tremendously. And that's true of many renewable energy sources. So there's a lot of investment in renewables. That's number 2. But third, let's face it, we have a battle. There are powerful vested interests. There's a lot of inertia. In my own country, you look at the Republican Party in the United States, it denies climate change. Now, one can ask, are they crazy? Are they fools? The answer is no. They're just corrupt, actually, I have to say. They're on the take from the oil industry. The oil industry says, we don't want to go that way. This is our oil, we want to burn it. Well, one political party, it completely goes that direction so far. The other one is also enticed by the big money in politics. So there's a lot of corruption. But the public in the United States says by 70%, we have to invest in renewable energy. We have to clean up our act. So even though powerful interests have tried to deny this, the public says we don't like droughts, we don't like floods, we don't like extreme storms, we don't like these heat waves. And I think politics is therefore moving in the right direction. No,
Do you think politics is moving in the right direction?
Politics is, because the public, politicians generally are followers. They're not leaders most of the time. They're not so brave. If there are powerful interests, they'll go in that direction. But when the public says, we don't want this damage, and when any parent, like myself, or now a grandparent, says, I don't want the world to be wrecked for my grandchildren, and that's happening all over the world, people saying, stop this is crazy, don't destroy the planet, then the politicians begin to follow as well. That's really important.
But on the other spectrum, we have the implosion in the Middle East, we have terrorism, we have ISIS, and these are things that presumably would undermine our efforts to do things in a sustainable fashion.
Absolutely.
Especially it's creating a lot of people movement, and it's moving poverty around, it's increasing the refugee crisis in Europe, and we see what's happening in Europe. I mean, how much of a threat, or how much of in terms of trying to fulfill our sustainable goals, these things that we did not actually foresee back in 2005 or in 2000 when we started out on the Millennium Development Goals?
Conflict is the biggest risk, and some of us did foresee that if we go down the road of war, for example, 13 years ago, the U.S. launched the war in Iraq. That was what we call a war of choice. That wasn't self-defense. The U.S. went in and bombed Iraq. At the time, I said, this is horrible. What idiocy. This is going to create problems for years and years and years. Unfortunately, I was right about that. These wars have been wars of choice. Just like you study climate change to say what should be done, should we go for solar or wind energy, you can look at war the same way and not say that's inevitable, but ask what are the causes. In the Middle East, actually, we're at the 100th anniversary this month of a treaty called the Sykes-Picot Treaty, which was a secret treaty of Britain and France to divide up the Middle East. Pure European imperialism. That secret treaty started 100 years of chaos.
We are feeling the consequences
We
now.
still feel the consequences, 1 century. So I have a slogan, 1 century is enough. I want the meddlers from outside, I want the UK, France, now the United States, to back off. And I want to say to the countries in the region, Iran, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, come on, you're big powers. You've lived with each other for 2,000, 3,000 years. Get your act together and stop this violence. Because what's really happening is that these are wars in which big powers are using the war to solve, or not solve, but to try to pursue their geopolitical interests. It's obviously only creating suffering. We need to get the big powers to say, stop these wars, and the regional powers to have responsibility. Because really, in Syria, this is a conflict between Saudi Arabia and Iran, for example. The Sunni-Shia divide. Well, that divide's 1,000 years old. Plus, it's enough. Stop. We have to get on with life. And this is really important right now. And when big powers like the United States come in and meddle, they create a huge mess. So I believe that ending these conflicts is also part of our thinking. You know, we can create a strategy, we can create a sound arrangement. I'm all for the United Nations having more responsibility and taking responsibility to say these wars have to end. And the truth is, these wars are doubly disastrous. One, obviously, they're ending up with lots of people dead and 10 million displaced people in Syria. But second, they're draining our attention from climate change, from ending poverty, from better education for our children, from all the things that are truly, truly within reach and that are achievable if we focus on them.
Yeah, the other thing is global, particularly financial institutions. Now, we see sort of inequality, at least the way I see it, is actually growing, and immensely. And it's not just, in developing countries. We also see it in the United States, right? And especially now with the 1% or 0.1% versus the 99%. And that is becoming a sort of the cry of the hearts, particularly of the young people. That's why they're very attracted to, for example, Bernie Sanders. Now, how can we create institutions or financial systems that can actually solve the inequality as opposed to actually polarizing, these problems? Because I think, when we talk about prosperity and ending, poverty, economic institutions are very important.
There is a tendency for the rich to get richer, and that's partly because the rich have better information, they're able often to trick the poor, and they're able to buy government because there's a lot of corruption all over the world, like the Panama Files have shown once again. So that tendency is very real. But it's also possible to fight against that. And just last week, I was in Scandinavia, in Norway and Sweden. Those are two countries where the income distribution is very narrow, where if you're born to a relatively poor family, you have a good chance in life. You go to quality schools, you have free access to quality education, to health care, to child care, and so forth. So all the things are taken care of. Now, the Swedes pay their taxes. They pay their taxes, and then the government provides good services, including services for relatively poor households. So there's almost no poverty, in fact.
The Scandinavian countries are often, held as our pillar examples. But then, on the other hand, their country, they have peace there, they have stability, and then they're small countries with relatively small population, right. And they're more or less homogenous. They don't have too many immigrations and so on. Plus, they do have policies that actually put they value equality, they value education, they value the environment. And yet a lot of the places around the world, including the United States and including in Indonesia, because we're very similar in so many respects.
Very big countries.
These things we don't really value as much. Now, I'm interested in being, the social, the Sustainable Development Solutions Network. What are the strategies to get these values become something that is of global relevance, really?
The whole idea of the Sustainable Development Solutions Network is to learn from each other, to think hard about the problems, to do analysis, to cooperate worldwide. We have an SDSN, a Sustainable Development Solutions Network for Indonesia, for Southeast Asia. The headquarters is in Bali, which is absolutely wonderful because we can learn from Bali, also from the Trihita Karana philosophy, which is a balance of life philosophy, which is really sustainable development, and that's a long tradition in this country. So I believe that this is possible, that we can find our values and our roots. I've been working a lot with the Vatican in recent years, and when Pope Francis speaks about these issues, people of every religion all over the world say, yeah, he's speaking values that I support also, whether that person's Roman Catholic or Buddhist or a Muslim or any other major faith. So there's a lot of commonality worldwide. People want values. Young people really are hungry for this. When the Pope went to Brazil, I think 3 million young people came to greet him. And so, of course, I'm so lucky to teach at a university. I'm dealing with young people all the time, and I see that they are inspired to make this work. That's our big hope, of course.
Well, he's a role model, the Pope. I mean, we have so few role models these days. That's the thing.
Well, can't we find some more? Because people should rise to the occasion and be role models in their own communities. They should be role models in their businesses. You can take, in a business, take a CEO of one of the world's largest businesses, Unilever, Paul Polman, who's one of the world's most successful business people. He's going all over the world to say, we need sustainable development, and he's inspiring other business leaders to say, yes, that's important for our business also, but we're not just business people, we're human beings, and we need it for our families, our children, our communities. And so role models can come in many places and in many sectors, and in every community. One of the things that Scandinavia has, you mentioned, it's small. But if you take a big country like Indonesia, there are many different parts of this country, 17,000 islands. If you take the United States, we have our 50 states and we have hundreds of major cities. We don't always have to think about the national scale. We can think about leadership at the local scale to really make a city work or a village work or local community work. And that can make a huge difference for the lives of people there. That can inspire the next door neighbors, that can inspire others, so this can spread.
examples of the kinds of solutions that Indonesia can provide, or can, be part of the solutions, as opposed to just, wallowing in the same problems? Because we have the people, problem as well in increasing population, but also increasing equality. We have environmental problems as well, and we still have poverty. But what can we do to be not only the part of the solution, but being the driver of the solutions in the SDSN network?
I think first, unfortunately, Indonesia is very vulnerable to a lot of the global environmental changes. This is an archipelago country. If the sea level rises, of course, it would be disaster.
Yeah.
So we absolutely need to stop the climate change, because that's the major cause of the sea level rise. How to do that? That's shifting from coal, oil, and gas, which are the three main energy sources for Indonesia, to renewable energy. But this country has so much renewable energy potential. It never thought about it, because why should we go for geothermal, many people here said, when we have so much coal? But now we know coal isn't safe. But nobody has to be desperate, because Indonesia has perhaps the world's greatest geothermal potential. There's also a lot of sunshine in this country. There's also a lot of wind potential in this country. There's a lot of hydroelectric potential. There's a lot of ways to have clean, green energy. And Indonesia should adopt those. And by mastering those technologies, we'll then have business models to help other countries and make money on it as well, because Indonesia should get into the renewable energy business in a big way. It never thought about it, because it says, oh, we have so much coal, oil, and gas, what do we have to do? But now that we know that those fossil fuels are no longer safe for the long term, making that transition is really important. Another thing that is a general principle, but especially for a country like Indonesia, which is so spread out across thousands and thousands of islands, is information technology is now key. Because what used to take so long to travel, or almost impossible to reach some of the far-flung places, now is instantaneous communications. This means that even in remote areas of Kalimantan, you can have quality schools, online training, teachers and doctors being trained. If someone needs a diagnosis in Kalimantan, before there were no doctors. Now you're in front of a camera, and the diagnosis can be done from Jakarta very easily.
As long as we have the infrastructure now.
Build the infrastructure. That's part of the solution. Invest in an information platform. Just like there's a smart Jakarta, smart city initiative, we need smart cities throughout Indonesia.
We have to be a smart country.
Absolutely.
But do you see the present government, are we on the right path? Is the commitment there, and you see the competency and the vision? Because, as with so many goals, often the proof comes in, the pudding, basically. Implementation is, at the end of the day, is the key to making this work, right?
We're very hopeful, and I'm very excited. I met with the Minister of Planning, Bappenas, and heard about the very strong intentions, for instance, of the President to end the peat burning, which of course has plagued this country and its neighbors, because the smog and the soot and the haze goes next door. I was in Malaysia, coming from Kuala Lumpur. Everyone's talking about the haze in the region, from Singapore and so forth.
It's one of our major exports.
Exactly. So the President is saying this has to end. Now, how to end it? Of course, there are powerful interests. There are a lot of local communities that are engaged in the peat fires. It's not so simple, but there's satellite data. There's real-time information that 10 years ago could never have been done. You might learn about the fires weeks later and not know, of course, who started it, what happened. Now you have satellite readings potentially every single day. One can monitor some of this, and the President said, you lose your concession if you continue this kind of bad behavior. So figuring out new tactics, new strategies, using smart technologies to get to the goals, I think, is really crucial. And Bappenas also has a program now for essentially helping every village around the country. There's going to be real funding. I'm going to be speaking with the Minister of Planning and other colleagues about how this can be effectively put to use, especially, again, using information technology to say, when the money is spent, it's not just wasted by some local politician, but it's really spent for the benefit of the community. So I think there's smart ways to move forward right now.
And also making the whole thing as part of the government policies. I mean, that's you know, at
This
the end
is
of the day,
why we
it's
need the
very
goals.
important.
If we don't have goals, we can't get anywhere.
How do you do that? How do you measure things? Do you, I mean, because obviously, you know, you're as the director of the UN SDGs, I mean, how do you make sure that countries are on the track? How do you make sure that policies are, you know, inclusive, that infrastructure is being built, that education is the #1 top priority, that the planet is being, you know, prioritized?
I'm a professor, a teacher for now 36 years, so I give report cards. And one of the things we'll be doing in the SDSN, actually releasing it this July, is a first report card on the Sustainable Development Goals, a Sustainable Development Goal Index. And this is not just to be a report card, though it's a little bit like that, but it's also to be what we call a dashboard. There will be reds, yellows, and greens. If you get a green on SDG 4, that means you're on the right track. But if you get a red on SDG 7, that means you better pay attention. That's a priority for your country. Now, this is the first year report card. By 2030, that's the final report card. Did the country graduate? So we're going to be pretty tough along the way and really try to hold everyone accountable to perform.
Okay, Professor Sykes, I hope you're right.
Let's work on it together. Thank you for the time.
Okay,
Great
thank
to be
you
with
for talking to us. It's been wonderful and a lot of insight that we get from you. Program Tujuan Pembangunan Berkelanjutan SDGs yang dimulai pada tahun 2015 dan akan berakhir pada tahun 2030 ini telah diadopsi oleh 193 negara termasuk di Indonesia. 17 target yang harus dicapai diantaranya mengentaskan rakyat dari kemiskinan, kesehatan yang terjamin, kualitas pendidikan, persamaan gender, energi bersih dan terjangkau, peningkatan kesejahteraan ekonomi dan lapangan pekerjaan, juga keadilan hukum dan institusi yang kuat. Di Indonesia sendiri, pembangunan yang berkelanjutan diharapkan dapat menjadi jalan untuk meningkatkan kesejahteraan dan juga menurunkan angka kemiskinan. Namun tentunya dibutuhkan kerja keras serta keseriusan dari pemerintah dan juga didukung oleh pihak-pihak lain seperti swasta dan juga masyarakat dan kita-kita semua agar semua target tujuan pembangunan yang berkelanjutan ini dapat tercapai pada tahun 2030. Demikian Insight dan jangan lupa saksikan kembali Insight besok bersama saya Desi Anwar. Sampai jumpa. Bye-bye.